The meeting to order. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro 109 du comité permanent.
Welcome to meeting number 109 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-3H and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, December 6th, 2023, the committee is resuming today its study of the federal government's use of technological tools capable of extracting personal data from mobile devices and computers.
Pursuant to the standing orders, members are attending in person in the room or remotely using the Zoom application. Again, as I always do, a reminder to all members to be mindful of your earpieces so that they don't cause feedback and damage to our interpreters. The interpreters today, by the way, are on a remote basis. I believe that all members were notified by the clerk of that yesterday. I'd now like to welcome our first witnesses for this first hour. We've got Minister Anita Anand, who is the President of the Treasury Board. Welcome, Minister. And with her from the Treasury Board Secretariat, we've got Dominic Rochon, Deputy Minister and Chief Information Officer of Canada. Minister Anand, I understand you do have opening remarks, and you're going to address them to the committee. You have up to 5 minutes to do so. Please start.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the lands on which we are standing and gathered constitute unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. Et aussi, je vous remercie de me donner l'occasion.
I would like to thank you for the opportunity to highlight government's commitment to ensure the privacy protection of citizens.
Officer of the Government of Canada. Let me begin with this. Our government takes the privacy rights of Canadians and federal public servants extremely seriously, and it is one of our top priorities. Le gouvernement gère les fonds.
Government manages these funds using a series of policies and directives which are in consistent with our laws. As President of Treasury Board, I'm the person designated and in charge of enforcing the law on privacy protection and personal data protection, which outlines the requirements for privacy protection and data protection by federal institutions. This law equally grants individuals the right to access their personal information and data, which is detained by federal institutions, and to correct this data.
Implements policies, directives, and guidance to assist government institutions in meeting their obligations under this Act. However, it is important to note that heads of government institutions or their delegates are responsible for the proper implementation of the Act, as well as overseeing TBS's privacy policies within their institutions. One of these TBS policies is the Directive on Privacy Impact Assessment, which sets requirements for institutions to complete privacy impact assessments, or PIAs. A PIA is required when personal information is used for or intended to be used as part of a decision-making process that directly affects an individual. The directive requires that institutions undertake a PIA when implementing a new program or activity and when substantially modifying an existing program or activity. And that involves the creation, the collection, and the handling of personal information. Mr. Chair, it is important to note that the responsibility for privacy impact assessments rests with the institution responsible for the program. My
department commits to renew the confidentiality and privacy clauses, and we will have updates on the directive on assessing incidents on privacy. This update includes the commitment to rationalize evaluations on incidents of breaches of privacy and to seek out possibilities of improving this directive.
We've consulted with privacy experts on changes to the Directive on Privacy Impact Assessment and are engaging with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. We intend to publish the updated directive this summer. Heads of government institutions or their delegates are accountable for adhering to those rules that are set out in the Privacy Act and TBS privacy policies. Institutions will be best placed to provide context regarding the use of digital forensic tools in their respective environments. I am happy to be here alongside Mr. Rochon to discuss how TBS policy can be made more clear, streamlined, and easier to follow for those institutions on a day-to-day basis as we continue to respect the Privacy Act and privacy laws that are so important for the protection of personal information. With that, Mr. Chair, I will close my opening remarks and I'm open to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. We're now going to start our 6-minute rounds, the first round for today. And for that, I'm going to go to Madame Kuzi. Ms. Kuzi, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Minister, to the Ethics Committee. This is, of course, our second day together in a row. Yesterday, in the Government Operations Committee, I expressed my disappointment in your handling of the public purse $40 billion deficit, the $500 million where that was indicated you would make the commitment to try and find how the majority of those funds are actually from lapsed funds and reserves, not actually new amounts of savings. And of course, the second edition of the managerial guidelines you put out yesterday, since clearly the managerial guidelines of October were not effective in the 6-month period. We didn't even have an opportunity to touch on your role then in the oversight of the privacy of information. There was so much to cover yesterday. Frankly, I shudder at the thought of having to take over your role if necessary because of the incredible amount of work to do. But let's talk about then the PIA compliance today. So when the news broke on the lack of privacy impact assessment compliance across 13 different federal departments and agencies, you stated that each federal institute, as you did today, is responsible for enforcing the laws and the policies. I feel that this ignores the responsibility of the Treasury Board to provide the oversight and to ensure departments are enforcing these policies. After more time for reflection, I was here previously making this point. Would you not agree that it's the responsibility of the President of the Treasury Board to ensure federal departments and agencies are protecting the privacy of your primary constituents, the public service?
The Privacy Commissioner has received no complaints relating to a violation of the Privacy Act. The Privacy Commissioner has engaged in no investigation and has stated that there was no breach of the law. The role of the Treasury Board is to promulgate rules and policies relating to the governing of the public service, and those rules need to be enforced by deputy heads. And that is what is continuing to happen. We play a coordinating role across government to ensure that they have what they need in terms of information relating to government policy.
Right. I believe that the term that the Commissioner used was that it was an insult, that this sentiment was felt. Throughout the testimony that we received from the departments accused of not following the Treasury Board privacy policies, we received many different responses and a number of different responses. Some have stated they have the tools and are using them, but are now completing a privacy impact assessment. Others stated they completed a general PIA and that covered the tool, rather than specifically analyzing the security concerns of this invasive technology. Is it concerning to you that 13 departments using the same tool have completely different definitions of what compliance means when it comes to following the impact on the PIA?
So to be clear, as the designated minister under the Privacy Act, I'm responsible for the administration of the Act, but the deputy heads are responsible for implementing Treasury Board policies. And I am actually currently updating the directive on the privacy impact assessments. I will say that programs and activities require a PIA, not the forensic tools themselves. We have had a number of departments, in fact, a majority of those departments are conducting a PIA. We have reached out to them numerous times, as well as the Privacy Commissioner, and my CIO, Dominic Rochon, can add.
Thank you, Minister. I'll just add that indeed, with regard to the 13 departments in question here, we followed up with all 13 of them. There was a different setup with regard to the programs and activities in question. Most of them actually had PIAs. Then there's a question of whether or not they updated those PIAs at different moments in time when it was apparent that they took on new tools. And so we're getting that information, and I think out of the 13, 3 departments, for example, CRA, had a PIA for their activities, for their program, and had also flagged that they would be using forensic tools, so that was fully compliant. In other instances, the PIAs, there was a decision made that it did not require an update. There are a couple of departments there, Competition Bureau, CRTC, for example. And then in other cases, departments have said, out of an abundance of caution, we're going to actually update our PIA.
Thank you, Mr. Rochon, for that. Madam President, you say you're responsible for the administration of this, but not for. I just don't understand how this doesn't imply that you have complete responsibility and oversight as to ensuring. How can one have responsibility for the administration yet not have the responsibility to ensure that the proper documentation is completed for the protection of Canadians and their privacy? I'll try and get another question in briefly, Chair. I know my time is coming to an end. We've heard in this committee that mobile forensic devices, the forensic tools being used by numerous federal departments, are not necessarily spyware, but have the same capabilities and are provided by the same suppliers. Do you agree, Minister, that this technology is invasive and violates the privacy of public servants and Canadians it is used on?
I'm going to need a quick response.
There was no violation of the Privacy Act, and the Privacy Commissioner did not launch an investigation and received no complaints. There was no violation of the Privacy Act.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Thank you. Merci, Madame Cousy. Ms. Khalid, 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today. Minister, when did you first find out about this issue, and what steps have you taken since then after learning about this issue, to rectify it?
The issue relates to the use of PIAs relating to privacy law that departments are undertaking. A PIA is like a checklist, and it ensures that the protection of personal information of Canadians continues to occur on a department-by-department basis. So when I was first sworn in, of course, I received numerous briefings relating to my obligations as Minister, and I will continue to make sure that Treasury Board policies are understood and distributed across government. It was the end of November when the article was released. Of course, I was briefed by my team at the time, and I will now ask Mr. Rochon if he could elaborate on the steps we took thereafter.
Thank you, Minister. Indeed, on December 4th is when the Privacy and Responsible Data Team, which is a team within the Office of the Chief Information Officer, followed up with all 13 organizations. We came up with a series of 6 questions. Obviously, the first question being, did your institution use these tools or software described in the article? Secondly, which personal information banks are associated with those programs or activities? Because a PIA is required on a program or an activity, not an actual tool. What are the legal authorities under which those programs or activities operate? We then asked whether or not the program area consulted their Section 10 delegate as to whether or not the Privacy Act was addressed to look at those tools. And we also asked some questions about the procurement of those tools as well.
I will just add, I don't know if it is clear, but there are statutory obligations to undertake investigations, in which case these forensic tools are required. But before they are actually used in the collection of any personal information, a warrant is required from a judicial standpoint. And so there is a very high threshold before these instruments are utilized. It is not taken lightly. Obviously, there are legal parameters that must be respected, the Privacy Act, as well as the governing legislation, as well as judicial authorization relating to a warrant. So the threshold is high.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Now, you spoke about privacy impact assessments in your opening remarks. Why are privacy impact assessments important, do you think?
So institutions are required to undertake a PIA for a program or activity in order to protect the privacy of Canadians. So when personal information is being used or it's intended to be used as part of a decision-making process that directly affects the individual, when there are modifications to existing programs or activities where personal information is intended to be used. And privacy impact assessments enable then the department and department heads to mitigate privacy risks. That is one of the advantages of the PIA. And I am going to revise the PIA directive. I'll be issuing it this summer, and I will be updating it to ensure that it will be well understood by all departments. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Now, the Privacy Act, are PIAs required, are departments required to provide PIAs based on the Privacy Act?
They are not, PIAs are not mandatory. There is, as I said, it's a checklist of items to make sure that Privacy Act considerations and the protection of individuals' personal information is paramount. And so it enables that assessment and risk analysis to occur. And as I said, because those investigations are required under statute, so for example, whether it is the CRA to prevent fraud or to investigate fraud, that's a prime example. These forensic tools can be useful, but they just can't be implemented without the legislative and judicial oversight.
And do you think that there should be a legislative oversight as to how PIAs are conducted within different departments?
I spoke with Minister Varani last night. I know that he is examining the Privacy Act as a whole from a Minister of Justice standpoint. We are updating our own directive, which is solely within the Treasury Board authority, and that is my realm. And so I want to make sure that that checklist of items, that PIA, that risk analysis that will be done by departments will occur. Consultations are ongoing, and we need to make sure that we do this right. And so that is a systematic process. And as I said, I will come forward this summer with more to say on an updated directive. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. How much time do I have?
13 seconds.
Okay, well then. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Ms. Khalid. And Minister, Monsieur Villemure, pour 6 minutes. Commencez, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing this morning. I hope you can shed light on some gray areas. When you learned in December in the CBC radio article that there were no assessments, PIA assessments, were you surprised? It is important for me as a minister to be here to ensure oversight of the law and of all the laws under my department. But of course, when I heard this news, I had conversations with my department, with my team, and I know that the necessary steps were taken in order to reach out to the departments concerned. We didn't have all the facts from the beginning, but now we have a method in place to ensure that we will to ensure that we're on the right course. Mr. Vachon, were you surprised? Surprised in the sense that, well, I was not in this position at the time, but from what I understand, the surprise was from the fact that it wasn't clear across departments what was required. There were supposed to be PIAs. So privacy impact assessments, and we had to have a number of programs and activities as part of this. And most government agencies and departments had this in place for their programs and activities. But knowing that by using these tools, they had to update their PIAs was the element. So this allows maybe room for interpretation, and that is where our directive leaves that leg room for the departments to have that interpretation. Hence the explanation from the minister that we are currently updating the directive. And what we will do is that we will put in place a directive that will explicitly explain that the new technological tools will require an updates of PIAs. Well, there was one of the departments which said there was a PIA that was as old as 2006, and that was probably prior to Twitter. And with new technological instruments and such a technological advancement, it would be surprising that this would not have impact on privacy. And I think this is a bit neglectful. I understand that there are a number of gray areas which you will clarify, and I agree with that. But in most cases, we saw some people who said, well, it didn't seem very important or was accessory. And I know that it is not obligatory. Madam President of Treasury Board says it is obligatory but not required. I mean, maybe there's a compliance issue to be clarified here. The obligation is to conduct an analysis to see what the impact is. Now, if you've already assessed the privacy factors under your program, it is already clear that you're going to conduct investigations, maybe relating to an individual, be it under the law, the Act on Border Services or for fiscal purposes. I think it goes without saying that an assessment of privacy, the incident on privacy, will come into play. And the fact that we do this through interviews, that we go through your personal items, and that we use a tool which is more precise in order to go identify specific items of information. This does not mean that there will be an additional impact on you. Please allow me take an example that is out of this committee. We had someone from RCMP who told us that when we use a forensic tool like this one, at first we used to have microphones on the lamps, for instance, but now sometimes a microphone is not the same as the phone with which you sleep at night, but the potential violations are broader, right? Yes, I completely agree with you, and that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that this would take an assessment, and in that example, I would say that assessment should, for it to be concluded, we need to update the PIA. Miss Annan, it is required but not legally required. I noted that out of the 13 government departments, there was a total lack of consequences. Well, they were informed, but I don't like the word penalties, but there were no clear consequences. I mean, no consequences equaling maybe the violations that were committed. This is not the case because the Privacy Commissioner did not find any violations. There was no violation of the law. So, well, I'm not going to waste my 30 seconds. So if the commissioner did not receive any complaints, it was because there was no violation. But you mentioned that he did not receive any complaints. The absence of complaints, it does not guarantee that there's total compliance. So I can explain in the sense that, well, at CRA, they mentioned that there was a PIA in place, and they mentioned that they were using these tools. I don't think it is a surprise that these tools are used, but we are not surprised. And we want to make sure that when people start using these kinds of tools, that they ensure that they update their PIAs. And in this case, we followed up immediately within a week. We followed up with questions to find out, do you have a PIA? Did you ask the right questions? And I could provide further details in writing if you so desire. Thank you, Mr. Wilmer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome to committee, Ms. Annan. I've certainly had the pleasure of working with you on other committees, and I want to give you the opportunity to perhaps summarize, at least from my understanding, a couple of key questions as it relates to the testimony of previous witnesses before committee. It seems like there are some significant gaps in what the directives are and the mandate coming from the Treasury Board and how it's actually being implemented across the various departments and agencies. And so I believe in your remarks, you had mentioned there being some upcoming changes as it relates to the Treasury Board. So you're, as I'm to understand, embarking on modernizing your own department's adherence to PIAs. Is that correct?
We are offering and continuing to work on this revised directive on PIAs. We're going to update it. I'll be publishing it in the summer. What do we need to clarify? Maybe that was at the heart of your question. Well, we want to specify that if you change your software, for example, you're going to need a PIA going forward, that you can't rely on previous PIAs once new software or new tools are being used. Those are the types of clarifications we want to make. And again, in response to the previous question and this one, it is within Deputy Head's purview to make sure that they are enforcing every Treasury Board directive and policy and guideline, not only this one. And deputy heads actually have the ability to suspend, demote, and terminate if they find a violation of the law and Treasury Board policy. And this will continue to be the case, including with the updated PIA.
Thank you. And I do want to make note, this is a directive, correct, from the Treasury Board to ministries?
That's right.
And yet the culture was, the general, I'm going to say, the way that I viewed the testimony of many of them that came before this, is that they treated it as almost being optional. How, as the president of the Treasury Board, suffices to say you've already kind of delegated the authority to the ministries, but how do you, as the president of the Treasury Board, intend on ensuring that your directives are adhered to across the whole, range of departments and agencies?
I want to specify that PIAs are not mandatory. They are basically a checklist that deputy heads can go through to make sure that personal information is being protected. My role relates to the Privacy Act as a whole, and being the person responsible for the administration of the Privacy Act. That's going to include issuing policy requirements to which departments must adhere. And as I said,
Ms. Nan, respectfully, so it's not mandatory? So you're just suggesting that they do privacy assessments? It's not a directive, it's not within the mandate of departments to do this?
departments have to respect the Privacy Act. That's the role of all of us.
So
Make
are
sure
PIAs,
that personal information is protected.
are PIAs
And
part of the Privacy Act?
I'll ask Dominic Rochon to.
I would prefer that you answer the questions.
Sure.
Is a PIA not included in the Privacy Act?
The PIA is not mandatory. It is part of the directive of the Treasury Board. The Privacy Commissioner provides advice and information to us
So when you
relating
send
to
directives, it's not mandatory? Help me understand that.
directives are mandatory, but it provides circumstances in which Treasury Board tools should be implemented. So every single item in the directive provides guidance to departments, and then departments can choose to.
I'm going to cut to the chase with 2 minutes left. We've worked together long enough to know that I'll cut right to the chase. I am watching with interest that it seems like in your reflections. You're going to be modernizing it for the Treasury Board. We heard in testimony from departments that if it was mandatory, there'd be clearer guidelines. So let's just cut to the chase. Will you be making privacy impact assessments mandatory on a move forward basis to ensure that the privacy of both not just Canadians, but also those that are employed in the federal service are protected by not just directive, but by through mandatory privacy impact assessments? Are you going to legislate this and make it part of the regulation?
This is not legislation. PIA directive is through the Treasury Board.
Okay, we don't need to
not
do
legislation.
semantics.
And I will say that we are in the midst of updating the directive. We are considering a number of avenues. Regardless, I expect compliance, and I will be reviewing the directive to ensure and strengthen this going
I just
forward.
need a straight answer from you, Ms. Anand.
We're in the process of updating it, and I'd be happy to come back and talk to you once this directive is updated.
You're the president of the Treasury Board. You can
Yes,
make
I
that
am.
statement right now and say, yes, we're committed to going forward so we don't end up back in this mess.
The Privacy Act is also looking at changes right now, so we are coordinating with Minister Varani and the Privacy Commissioner about how to ensure compliance occurs. Those discussions are ongoing.
Have
It
you
is not
contemplated
my
making it
style to
mandatory?
rush into making major changes into the directive or suggesting such changes in the law, but we are taking
Okay.
our careful time to make sure that we get this right. And as I said, it's just a few months away, and we
I
will
have
be
another
issuing
2-minute
a
round. We're going to
revised
pick back up on this
Okay.
conversation. I'd ask that you
Thank
not
you.
run
Thank
the
you.
clock out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Minister. That completes our first 6-minute rounds. Going to go for 5 minutes now. We've got Mr. Barrett, followed by Mr. Sabera. Mr. Barrett, go ahead, please.
We've heard there are 635 IT middlemen that the Government of Canada does business with. Is that number correct?
There are a number of intermediaries.
What is the
very
number?
much, I would very much like clarification of the question, or if my CIO has anything he wants to add.
The question is very straightforward. We've seen, and I'm certain that you're aware of the issue of companies that are skimming 25 and 30% off multi-million-dollar government contracts, two-man operations like GC Strategies and Dalian, Cordex, the list goes on. We've heard the number is 635. Is that number correct? Companies like that.
Dominic?
I can only confirm that PSPC, I think, is the one that came up with this number. I'm not sure that's the specific number, so I can't confirm for sure.
What's the number you have, sir?
I don't have a number specifically on,
Okay,
on
so
that,
Minister-
but I do know that the OCG is doing a horizontal audit, which I think both ministers announced yesterday, looking into the issue, as well as PSPC.
So you don't know, Minister, is the answer.
I announced a horizontal audit yesterday, so I will find out.
The 3 companies identified for fraudulent billing yesterday, were they involved in ArriveCan?
And that is being run out of PSPC. I do not believe, but I cannot confirm, and I know that I'm under oath here, so I'm sorry that I cannot confirm that.
Do you know the names of the companies?
I do not.
How many more companies have been identified for fraudulent billing?
That
You
is
can
not
just leave your mic.
information.
They'll turn it on for you,
Sorry.
Minister.
That is not information that has come to me as president of the Treasury Board.
So you don't know. So yesterday's announcement said that was the first wave. That $5 million of fraud was just the first wave.
Point of order, Chair.
Go ahead on your point of order, Ms. Khalid.
I know that you've been very judicious in talking about relevance, but I do really question the relevance of this point of this line of questioning here, Chair.
Well, I'm going to allow Mr. Barrett to continue with the floor. I heard what Ms. Kuzi had to say, and I'm sure Mr. Barrett will bring it back to where he needs to go. Mr. Barrett, you have the floor. Go ahead, please. I did stop you.
We heard in yesterday's announcement that $5 million of corruption was just the first wave. So that implies that it being the first, that there's more to come. So how many more companies have been identified?
I think it's important to note that we are taking this extremely seriously, referring cases to the RCMP whenever fraud is uncovered, and that is exactly what we will continue to do. And I, as Treasury Board President, do not have the jurisdiction over the referral of those cases. I introduced the horizontal audit that we will be undertaking,
Minister,
an update to the manager's guide,
You
and
said
the
that you take
conflict
it
of interest
seriously,
directive. Of
but
course I do.
you failed to take any action until the Liberal government has failed to take any action until they're dragged kicking and screaming by Conservatives to take action, and that's evidenced in the Arrive scam scandal. Why
Point of
did
order
you?
again, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead, Ms. Khalid.
The topic of the day has to deal with the federal government's use of technological tools capable of extracting personal data from mobile devices and computers. I don't understand where Mr. Barrett is going. I know that you've allowed him some time to get to where he needs to go. I'd like to hurry him along there, Chair.
And he still has some time, and he has the floor. So I'm going to go back to Mr. Barrett. I stopped your time for 2 minutes, and you're at 2 minutes and 2 seconds. Mr. Barrett, go ahead.
I can only explain it to you. I can't understand it for you, Ms. Khalid. Ma'am.
Sorry, I'm not sure what that means, Chair.
Yeah, Ms. Khalid,
No, but if
Mr.
a
Barrett-
member
Mr.
is
Barrett
going
has
to
the
speak to
floor.
me, then I would
Mr.
like to
Barrett has the
understand what he's
floor.
trying to say.
Mr. Barrett has the floor. I'm going to allow him to continue, and I hope that we're not interrupted. Go ahead, Mr. Barrett.
Your Liberal government failed to take any action on ArriveCan until they were dragged kicking and screaming. We hear time and time again that you take it seriously, but you, Minister, voted against having the Auditor General investigate ArriveCan. Why?
Actually, we do take it very seriously. That's why I made a very extensive announcement yesterday with announcing the horizontal audit across government. I published a new
we heard that in your previous
guide
answer,
relating
Minister.
to
Different
the
question this
professional
time.
services.
November 2nd, 2022, you voted against the audit. Why?
Again, I take the issue extremely seriously, and
But
as
not
soon
seriously enough to have the Auditor General
as soon
investigate.
as I read the Auditor General's report,
That you
I
voted against.
got to work to make sure that
Point
we
of order,
have
Chair.
Mr. Barrett, I'm just going to ask that you allow the minister time to answer the question, if you
Thank
don't
you,
mind.
Mr. Chair.
Ms.
Thank
Dam-
you, Chair.
Ms.
Yes,
Damoff,
and
on your point.
that
go
was
ahead.
what, he's not allowing the minister to speak. If he's going to ask questions, it would be the polite thing to do to let her speak. And I think it's really rude of a member to call another member dumb in front of
I-
everyone. I think that was completely uncalled for earlier in the way he spoke to Mr.
I didn't hear
Khalid.
that language being used, Ms. Damoff, so.
It was pretty
I
close,
pre-
Chair.
Well, it wasn't used in the context in which you said it. Mr. Barrett, you have a minute. Continue, please.
Minister, you've demonstrated your your lack of seriousness on the issue by trying to shut down that Auditor General's report. And again, like I said, this is only when you're dragged kicking and screaming that you take action. Was there a privacy impact assessment done on the $60 million ArriveCan app?
I want to clarify that I respect the office of the AG extremely seriously. I have read her report.
It's a yes or no question.
I take this issue seriously, and that's why I made the announcement that I did yesterday.
So your defense, and again, you didn't answer the question. Your defense on the question of privacy impact assessments, and there having been no wrongdoing by your departments, is, well, there's been no investigations launched. Ma'am, there's over a dozen investigations that have been launched in your government's $60 million Arrive scam. Well, what does that tell you? If the absence of an investigation implies innocence, what do 12 investigations, what do you infer from that in the case of Arrive scam?
Very quick answer, please.
There was a PIA done on the application called ArriveCan.
Is there a delay
No.
between she seems to be answering my questions out of sequence or missing them.
I can't determine that, Mr. Barrett. Thank you. Mr. Sabera, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Minister, to this committee. Just wanted to turn back to actually the motion at hand with regards to privacy and so forth, and the privacy risk assessment process. I will try, Chair, to stay on relevance in terms of what the motion speaks to and why the Minister is here today. I think that is the job for all members of this committee. Minister, just a couple straightforward, hopefully straightforward questions, and I'm sure they will be. In terms of the privacy risk assessment, privacy impact assessment, excuse me, why is a privacy impact assessment so important for the employees that are onboarded on to the federal government?
It all goes back to the Privacy Act and making sure we're respecting personal information that is collected or intended to be collected in the interests of all public servants. That is the work that we need to do across government to protect personal information under the Privacy Act. We work closely with the Commissioner's office and making sure that our directives and our tools and guidelines are in respect at all times of the Privacy Act. I will say again, in this case, the Privacy Act and Commissioner did not find any violation of the legislation, and there were no complaints lodged and no investigations undertaken. And so what we can do from a Treasury Board perspective is examine that directive and strengthen it, which is exactly what I'm doing, and I will publish that in the summer.
Okay, thank you, Minister. And I believe there's on our side there are 3 lawyers sitting on this committee, if I'm not mistaken, Anthony or Nikra. Oh, and I'm not. I think Pam and I are the only ones that are non-lawyers. But there's a balance required in terms of the Privacy Act and these privacy impact assessments that are made by the government. Can you speak to the privacy? And before you answer that, Minister, you are prudently undertaking a spending review at Treasury Board, and I take it there is no impact on that side in terms of how the government views privacy and so forth, and if you can speak to the ongoing success or measures that with regards to your spending review.
Yes, there's no impact on the compliance with the Privacy Act, which we take very seriously. We are on track to save $15.8 billion over 5 years and $4.8 billion every year thereafter in the spending review. So we've done 2 stages of that spending review now, where I've tabled 2 tranches of results, and we will be continuing it as specified in the fall economic statement.
Okay, thank you. And Chair, I have another minute or 2, I think.
You have 2, Mr.
Okay.
Sabera.
Minister, after hearing what departments have said regarding the use of this software with regards to the privacy, do you have any concerns?
I think that we need to update our directive in order to ensure that departments are clear that when there's new software being used, that they need to do a PIA. I want to make sure that all measures are taken from a Treasury Board perspective to protect the personal information of public servants. Dom, did you want to add anything?
Thank you, Minister. I think what I would say is, having heard from all the departments, having reached out to them and understood exactly how they're using these tools, nothing has come about that has caused us pause with regard to an impact on privacy. Why? Because they've been following strict guidelines, protocols with regard to the use. That being said, as a matter of course, we want to make it clearer that anyone else that wants to start to delve into the use of these types of tools, they should automatically think about doing a privacy impact assessment when they bring it into their activities and their programs.
Okay, can I quickly follow up with Mr. Rochon? Mr. Rochon, when there are issues of non-compliance, how is that generally handled?
So issues of non-compliance would require, so we would follow up, as we did in this case. If there is a question, we would follow up with a department or agency and delve into the matter as to whether or not a PIA was indeed required. If we're in disagreement with the department on the topic, what we can do is we can ask them to report on it through their annual report. Of course, there's also, with regard to compliance, the Privacy Commissioner can do the same in terms of following up, look into the matter, launch an investigation.
Merci, Monsieur Sabera, Monsieur Rochon. Nous sommes à l'heure.
Thank you, Mr. Rochon. I think we are just in time for the next round of questions. 2.5 minutes for Mr. Vilmieux, followed by Mr. Green for 2.5 minutes, Mr. Brook for 5 minutes, and Mr. Baines for 5 minutes. And we will conclude the We will conclude right on time. Mr. Vilmere, 2 minutes and a half, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Anand, earlier on you mentioned that Treasury Board had a supervisory role and that you rely on the department ministers and other people to ensure the enforcement. I don't know that we want to summon all the ministers to appear here, but I have a direct question for you, and I'll try to, give you a timeline here. So an action happens. There's no PIA, and a directive being misunderstood. There's no complaint at the commissioner's office, and there's no complaint. There's no investigation, no consequences. And if CBC Radio didn't publish that article, we would not be here. And I'm worried because we would have avoided all of this if and only if the PIA was included in the act. So are you, yes or no, going to include the PIA in the act? Please do not rehash the answers we heard earlier. Thank you. As I mentioned, I spoke with Minister Rani, and he is currently studying what the next steps would be with this bill. And at the same time, I will publish the other version of our directive. So this is a topic on which we are currently working. So you will publish in the summer a new directive. Will there be any legislative changes? Do you have any intent to propose legislative changes? Is this a possibility that's envisaged? Could this potentially happen? This is something that doesn't rest in my hands right now. It is not my decision. It is an issue to take up with Minister Virani. But of course, since like I already did this week, I've talked with him often, and I will mention the possibility and the necessary considerations with regard to this issue. Do you think that we should summon Minister Virani to explain this to us here? He is in charge of our position with regard to this bill, and he is currently studying this bill. This rests with the committee and not with me. So thank you very much. Thank you again, Mr. Vilmere.
Ms. Anand, your mandate as the president of the Treasury Board is to provide oversight on administrative leadership and regulatory oversight. I'm concerned that you just won't come forward and at least, admit that there's a huge gap here. That's the purpose of why we're in this study. We have 13 departments and countless others, probably 120 plus others that are unknown in terms of whether or not they're effectively using privacy impact assessments. I want to know a little bit about your leadership, Ms. Anand. What action did you take upon learning through the media reports that 13 departments and agencies had not completed privacy impact assessments for the use of the personal data extraction tools? What did you do?
Immediately spoke with my team and was in touch with the department. That is how ministers are briefed to ensure that we are taking all actions necessary. You have heard that my department then reached out to all of the departments to hear exactly what they were doing. Now, 9 out of 13 of those departments have implemented PIAs, and we seek to ensure that compliance with privacy requirements occurs at all times. Yes, there is a problem. That's why the directive is being updated.
Ms. Anand, rather than reading your statement, what about the other agencies? Have you reached out to them? What have you done? You're the effective management board for the government. You're supposed to be providing oversight. You're supposed to establish policies and common standards for administrative personnel. This is your role. So how are you fulfilling it, and what assurances do we have that the other agencies and departments are in compliance? These are only 13 that got caught. We don't know about the other ones.
I am fulfilling my role, and I will assure you that we are in touch with departments regarding their compliance with Privacy Act and other Treasury Board policies. That's
I'll ask a direct
part of why I announced the horizontal audit yesterday.
I'll ask a direct question. Have you to this date, been in direct contact with all departments and agencies regarding privacy impact assessments, particularly as it relates to the story that broke on the 13 departments? Have you reached out to everybody?
With our team through annual reporting, Dom, could you fulfill that?
Very quickly, because I'm respectful of your time. Departments and agencies are responsible for providing personal information banks for all their programs and activities.
Respectfully, sir, the question was to the president. The president did not answer it. It just was as simple. You just said, like, take responsibility as a president. Did you reach out to everybody, Anita? Yes or no? It's that simple. If it's no, then it's no.
Okay. Minister, quickly.
Yes, the department has been in contact. Thank you for the question.
It wasn't that hard.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Brock for 5. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, privacy is extremely important to Canadians and public servants, but so is safeguarding the prudent use of taxpayer funds. Federal spending on outsourcing increased to $14.6 billion last year, which is 74% higher than when the Liberals under Justin Trudeau promised in 2015 to cut back on the use of external consultants. We now have evidence that the ArriveCan ballooned to at least $60 million. What you announced yesterday with your colleague, Minister Duclos, in my view, is only the tip of the iceberg, because Minister Duclos confirmed yesterday that the 3 companies in question that fraudulently billed taxpayers $5 million had nothing to do with ArriveCan, which brings into the broader question of that $14.6 billion in outsourcing. How many billions of dollars, how many millions of dollars more in fraudulent contracting schemes are out there? I know you talk about advanced data analytics, and this is how you uncovered the data. But the government always had this data capability. So the biggest problem that Canadians have with your government, Minister, is you're very reactive as opposed to proactive. One company alone had built 36 different federal departments, billing for the same hours in a given day. Why was that not detected in 2018 when they submitted their invoices with your advanced data analytics? Why wasn't that caught, Minister?
I want to specify that the Treasury Board did not have any involvement with the development of the ArriveCan Act.
I'm talking in a broader sense. Why wasn't the government able, with the capabilities of data analytics, to capture this in 2018 when it happened?
The app was built on an emergency basis under exceptional circumstances.
And the Auditor General basically said that a pandemic and the urgency does not mean you throw out the rules out the window. You had an obligation to safeguard taxpayer monies, and you abused that. You misused that. So what assurances do Canadians have that we're going to get to the bottom of the millions, if not billions of dollars?
Respecting.
Let me finish the question. What assurance can you give Canadians that you're going to actually follow up, you're going to identify these companies, you're going to refer it to the RCMP for possible investigation and criminal charges? What can you say about that?
I agree with the findings of the Auditor General's report. That is why I published yesterday an update to the Manager's Guide on professional services. I have also tabled through a series of estimates that we are reducing our reliance on outsourcing, including in the estimates prior to the holidays, $350 million in outsourcing contracts being reduced. Furthermore, reductions in the recent estimates that I have tabled to about $900 million in total. So we are working on continuing to reduce our reliance on outsourcing. That is something I take extremely seriously, and that's what I emphasized in my announcement yesterday.
Minister, your former role, one of your former roles, was Minister of Public Services and Procurement. You held that role from November the 20th, 2019 to October 26, 2021. I had before me the mandate letter that Justin Trudeau sent to you, and I'm going to read out various passages. I expect us to continue to raise the bar on openness, effectiveness, and transparency in government. It also means humility and continuing to acknowledge mistakes when we make them. Canadians do not expect us to be perfect. They expect us to be diligent, honest, open, and sincere in our efforts to serve the public interest. Your leader, Justin Trudeau, has been anything but apologetic. So I'm going to give you the opportunity, Minister. It's plainly obvious to Canadians that that wasted $60 million on an app that was very ineffective, that didn't save one Canadian life, that is now subject to numerous RCMP investigations. Are you prepared to admit your role, because during the rollout of 177 different versions of the app, you were the minister. Are you prepared here and now to apologize to Canadians for the lack of ministerial oversight? Yes or no?
I was not the minister. The app was developed at CBSA. I was the Minister of Procurement. My mandate was vaccines and PPE.
You were still part of that according to the Auditor General. Are you prepared to apologize to Canadians?
I was not the minister.
Are you prepared to apologize to Canadians?
Thank you, Mr. Brock. That concludes your time. I appreciate
that. Is
appreciate
incorrect.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Baines, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, did you have anything to add there at the end there? I think you were trying to.
Thank you very much. Yeah, yesterday at committee and again today, false allegations being thrown at a fellow member of Parliament and Minister of the Crown. I find that surprising, and I think that all members of the House of Commons need to deal in facts rather than conjecture and false allegations. So I do take issue with the way in which language is being abused in this committee and again yesterday.
Thank you for clarifying there. And thank you for joining us today. I want to just go back to the issues of non-compliance that came to light. How are they generally handled? How are these issues handled?
Again, the deputy heads of each department, that's the deputy ministers or the heads of organizations, are responsible for compliance with TBS guidelines, policies, and directives. And we, as the Treasury Board, make sure that we are in touch with departments to ensure that compliance. Dom, would you like to add anything?
Thank you, Minister. So as I think I mentioned in one of the earlier answers, if there's an instance of non-compliance, either found by the Privacy Commissioner or by us, there can be inquiries done, questions asked, requirements for a department or an agency to report further on mitigating factors in their annual report to follow up on that. And in extreme cases, there can be revocation of delegated authority, but I'm not aware of ever getting to that point.
Okay, so it's extremely important to have funding for, say, officers of the Parliament to do this work and hold government to account, ensure the trust is in our institutions, and the Office of the Auditor General is a prime example of this. And during the first year of the Harper government, the budget for this office was $78.6 million, and during the last year, it was only $81 million, and the current leader of the opposition was the minister responsible for safeguarding our democracy, and he did not ensure that officers of the Parliament were funding adequately. Can you explain to the committee your thoughts about ensuring adequate funding to these institutions and how that's being taken into consideration now?
Sure. Obviously, even through the spending review, what we are aiming to do is to not reduce funding to key organizations, especially where that would impact services to Canadians and the protection of Canadians' interests. So obviously, we take the protection of personal information extremely seriously, and I do as minister as well. And I will say, referring back to my colleague's question, if he had analyzed my role, he would see that I signed no contract relating to ArriveCan, and he would also see in the Auditor General's report that the Auditor General highlighted CBSA, which is a organization within the Department of Public Safety, of which I was not the minister. So once again, I think it's important to hold government to account, but while doing so, to speak with truth and professionalism rather than false allegations and conjecture.
Okay, and just on the analytics and finding, looking into the issues of non-compliance and having the ability to modernize new tools to get to the root of some of these non-compliance issues, like how current are these tools, and when were they brought into the use of government use?
Maybe I'll try to quickly answer that question. I don't believe we're in a situation of non-compliance. We are in a situation of interpretation of the rules, and I think that is where the minister has highlighted that we're going to be updating the directive on privacy impact assessments in order to be more specific, to clarify, and will make it better in terms of understanding when a PIA is actually required.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baines. Mr. Rochon, Minister, I want to thank you for appearing before committee today. We are going to suspend for a couple of minutes so that we can prepare for the next panel. The meeting is suspended for a couple of minutes. Thank you. second hour. I'd like to welcome now, as an individual, Mr. Marion Dion, former Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. Welcome back, sir. And also from the Office of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, Mr. Conrad von Fickenstein, who is the Commissioner. Before we go to opening statements, I have been asked by Monsieur Villemure for a few minutes near the end to discuss something. So I'm going to make sure that we grant that time, and it's regarding the social media study, Monsieur Villemure. So, okay, merci. Mr. Dion, if you want to start, please, for 5 minutes, go ahead.
In fact, Mr. Chair, we will be saving some time because I did indicate to the clerk this morning that I did not have any opening remarks, so I will stop right there.
You always impress me, Mr. Dion, with your succinctness. Appreciate that. Sir, Mr. Commissioner, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, thank you. I'll be equally succinct. Thank you for inviting me to today. I'll gladly answer your questions regarding any aspect of our work. Vous comprenez que je n'étais pas dans mon poste actuel.
You would understand that I was not in this position when this report was published, and I have no comment to make regarding this report.
Aquilino, at the request of Mr. Dario, Mr. Dion, so that he can help him recollect some facts which after 5 years may not be necessarily in the mind of Mario right away. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Commissioner. We are going to start our first of 6-minute rounds with Mr. Barrett. Go ahead, sir.
I'll just start by saying, Commissioner von Fickenstein, congratulations on your appointment as our commissioner. That's new since your last, but one of your frequent appearances in the time between you taking on the interim role and today. So congratulations on that appointment, and thank you for taking on the role. It's incredibly important. Canadians value the work that's done to ensure that the highest ethical standard is maintained. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Dion. Thank you for joining us today, sir. My question is, of course, about the Trudeau II report. How many people did you interview, and how many people made submissions to you?
I have, at the end of the report on the last page, Michael is finding the page. If I recall correctly, we had 22 people we contacted for documents, and we interviewed 7 out of memory.
So of the 22 you interviewed, 7, would those 7 have been then the top of your list? Is that how you'd characterize that?
It's in the public domain, Mr. Chair. So we did interview former Minister Morneau, former Minister Wilson-Raybould, Mathieu Bouchard was a senior advisor to the PM, Nathalie Drouin, Deputy Minister of Justice, Elder Marquez, senior advisor to the PM, and Michael Warnick, who was with you 2 days ago. The other people with whom we communicated we were satisfied that the documents they had forwarded were sufficient for us to understand their participation in the subject matter without having to interview them.
So Mr. Warnick said that you personally interviewed him. That's correct?
Yes.
Is that true for the other 6 people?
Yes, it is. Throughout my tenure, I was present every time anybody was interviewed. I was present. This was Madame Dawson's practice as well. I simply followed the same practice.
How many investigators, did you have that worked on the file?
We had 1 investigator, and we had 1 lawyer, Michael, who is here today, who played an extended role on this one, because Madame Richard was excluded from the file right on day 1. I gave clear instructions that Martine Richard was not to be involved in this investigation. So it was Marie-Josée Smith, Michael Aquilino, and I, period.
Is Ms. Smith still employed in the office? She is. You've said that in interviews following your retirement, sir, that your investigator has a set, or that you in the process used 49 questions. Is that the right number? It was a list of 49 questions?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I have no recollection whatsoever. I don't know. We don't know. I have no idea where this comes from. I don't.
Okay. If I recall correctly, I think it was in a podcast where you talked about your interview process, maybe with the Hill Times.
It's not possible, Mr. Chair, because we don't have a standard interview format.
Okay.
Each time, the way it works, each time we have a witness, Marie-Josée prepares a draft, Michael reviews it, I review it, and we follow the script, except that the commissioner is there to add, to emphasize certain things, to ask questions that come up because of earlier answers and so on and so forth. So there's no
form.
preordained format whatsoever.
In the case of the Trudeau 2 report, were you fully able to discharge your investigatory duties defined or provided for by the Act?
No, as I said so in the report, Mr. Chairman. We tried to obtain further documents that were covered by the Cabinet Confidences Convention, and we failed in doing so. So therefore, but I thought that we had nevertheless enough material to come to a conclusion, to a finding. That's why I did proceed absent the documents that were missing, that we still don't know what they contain.
Right. And that finding was a finding that, of a contravention, that the Conflict of Interest Act had been broken by Mr.
Section
Trudeau.
9 of the Conflict of Interest Act there was a contravention, as we refer to them, to Section 9 of the Act, which was the scope of the investigation. I decided on my own volition, in light of the media and what was being said elsewhere, to launch an investigation on February 8, 2019. The scope was Section 9,
Okay.
and I did find a contravention to Section 9.
Thank you very much, sir. Commissioner, are you investigating any board members at Sustainable Development Technologies Canada?
Talking to me?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry. I thought you were still dealing with
I just
my-
changed gears.
Can you
with
repeat your question, please?
With my last minute, a couple quick questions for you. Are you investigating any board members at Sustainable Development Technologies Canada?
Yes.
How many?
2.
And have you launched any investigations of your own accord, or only files that have been referred to you?
No, I have only launched investigation at the request of I think members of parliament or maybe the public, I don't know, but not on my own.
Have you interviewed relevant people in those cases at this point?
Mario explained to you the process, and that's exactly what we're following to, where we decide who has to be interviewed. We make a set of questions. The questions are being posed by the investigator. I'm there, I'm present. I may ask additional question or clarification if required.
So I have two quick questions in my last 15
Very
seconds.
quick.
Have you received access to all of the documents that you've requested? And when can Parliament expect a return on those reports, sir?
Yes, I have received all the documents I've asked for. We are interviewing a few more witnesses, and then as soon as we can, will issue a report. Obviously, I'm fully aware that time is of the essence. These things shouldn't drag out too long, both for the public but also for the person being investigated.
Thank you, sir.
So we will do it with due dispatch.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Damoff for 6. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks to our witnesses for being with us here today. Mr. Dion, thank you for coming to the committee to talk about a report that was done a number of years ago. I have some questions for you on Section 49.1 of the Act, where it talks about suspending your investigation. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but just for those that aren't, where you need to suspend an investigation when the commissioner believes on reasonable grounds that the public office holder or former public office holder has committed an offense under an act of Parliament. And there's more to it, but I'll leave it at that. And I know when you testified in 2022 about whether or not you would hesitate to turn something over to the RCMP, you responded that it was a mandatory provision, so not a choice the commissioner has, that it's an obligation to refer it to a police force that has jurisdiction. So you're always mindful of that in your investigation. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about this report and whether you referred it to the RCMP, I guess is the first question.
In any investigation, Section 49 is always present to mind because facts evolve. These investigations take several months. So in relation to the Trudeau 2 report, Michael Aquilino, who's with me, did a preliminary analysis of whether there were reasonable grounds to believe an offense to another act of Parliament was involved, and came to the conclusion that there wasn't such a situation. But throughout the investigation, we always have the question present on our mind because it's an absolute duty to do that. So at no point did I feel that I had reasonable grounds to believe that the Prime Minister had committed an offense to any other statute. Therefore, I did not refer the matter to the RCMP.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, and perhaps we could get our current commissioner to comment on this as well. The importance of independence of both the RCMP and the Commissioner of Ethics and Conflict of Interest.
Okay, well, as you appreciate, what is vested in the commissioner is a lot of discussion to look at the various situations that he faces and decide what to proceed. 49 is a perfect example of that. The commissioner independently investigates something. If there's something where he has reasonable grounds to believe a criminal offense may have been committed, he stops right away and he refers it to the RCMP. And that's because he is independent, but so is the RCMP, and obviously criminal things are more important than conflict of interest. So if there's a criminal one, it has to be first done. Once if the RCMP decides they do not want to investigate, or they investigate and conclude, then we continue with the conflict of interest. But the two should not interfere with each other. We both have a mandate. We both have to exercise it to the best of our ability. And the statute specifically vests persons' powers for criminal prosecutions, the RCMP, and for conflict of interest in us.
Thank you. And just before I go to Mr. Dion on the same question, I just wondered if you could comment on the importance of your office as well as the RCMP being independent from interference by politicians.
Yeah, well, the whole system is set up such way that we are independent. We are not partisan. We are not influenced by any consideration other than what is the mandate. In my case, make sure there is no conflict of interest, in the RCMP to make sure there are no criminal activities. That decision should be made objectively on the basis of fact and without any influence of connections, partisanship, or anything else.
Thank you. Mr. Dion, I wonder if you could comment on that.
I've said many times during my tenure that it is clear that Parliament intended that the Commissioner be tasked with the mandate of that Conrad has just described, in the conflict of interest sphere, and that the Commissioner was a person who government tried to ensure had some judgment when they first appoint him or her. And basically, I felt throughout those 5 years that I felt completely independent, nonpartisan. There was no attempt whatsoever at any point by anyone to try to influence in an appropriate manner, the work of the Commissioner. And I'm sure that should continue to be the case in the future because it's one of the safeguards that we have in our democracy, and everybody seems to understand that.
And do you want to comment on the independence of the RCMP as well?
Frankly, no, I don't think I'm qualified to do that because I have not read the RCMP Act in the last 30 years, so it's hard for me to
Okay,
imagine.
that's fair. That's fair. Well, thank you both for being here today. We appreciate, well, all three of you actually for being here today. And Chair, I know I only have about 10 seconds left, so I'll give it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Damoff. Monsieur Villemure, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing here today. Mr. Dion, you conducted this investigation, so I have 3 questions. Yes or no questions drawn from your report. Mr. Trudeau, did he try to influence Judy Wilson-Raybould? Obviously, the report concludes that Mr. Trudeau directly or through intermediaries tried on several occasions to influence the Minister of Justice. Did Trudeau try to influence the management of SCNC Lavalin? the pressures that were exercised on the former Minister of Justice showed that and the behavior of management of SNC Lebanon showed that they preferred a settlement rather than um, rather than a case before the law. Did Mr. Trudeau use his influence, therefore, to influence her? Well, the contravention is the use of his office in view of influencing somebody in an irregular manner. So you describe the concept of irregular, and you defined 4 areas where there was a use of this influence compared to public interest, and you observed that there was a contravention. Yes, there was a contravention to Section 9 directly. And sometimes it's often said that we should base ourselves on facts in order to conduct an investigation. The facts at your disposal, were they enough to draw that conclusion? I think we took about 40 pages to 40 detailed pages to detail the persons involved, what they did, and the facts which underpin my conclusion is what you'd find in the first 40 pages of the report. Well, I read it back in the day, and I read it again recently, and the Office of the Prime Minister's privacy. And I'll come back to RCMP's statement, which said that privacy, does it vary based on the context? And you responded by saying that there are moments when this discretion was less airtight. And do you think that
Come on
this
in if you
notion
want.
is something that can be applied?
The camera's facing the other way.
The camera's facing the other way?
Oh, my.
Ah, ouais, bon.
Okay.
Donc, je peux répondre parce que j'ai compris votre question.
I can address your question because I understood it, Mr. Chair. I will try to address the question. There's a certain familiarity with the use of secrecy and confidentiality, and we talked about this. And secondly, I worked at the Privy Council office. I was in charge of the unit that was in charge of issues regarding confidentiality at the office for a year. And when we discussed the Trudeau 2 report, when we were confronted with 6 or 9, I don't remember the exact number, but a number of witnesses who said, I will send you all the documents that you requested, except for those that are covered based on the that notion in the cabinet. I was a bit surprised because the law on conflict of interest says that the commissioner should benefit from this particular situation. And we wrote to the clerk of the Privy Council, Mr. Schubert, to insist to have more than what the Act allowed Ms. Remble to share. And we were still denied access to those documents. And then I had to determine whether I had enough documents to continue. And I reflected on the possibility of going to federal court to contest the clerk's decision. All through my 43-year career, I always paid attention to the use of public data and considered that it was not necessary to spend 3 years and $2 million to establish that I will have or not have access to these documents. So we continued in the absence of those documents. When RCMP decided to investigate on the same topic following the publication of your report, were you surprised by the conclusions of RCMP? No, I wasn't surprised, but it's not founded on any grounds. So they did not equally have access to those documents, and they had the same conclusion as yourself. And this is something that's within the realm of possibility, right? If we're talking of criminal activity or contraventions to the code from a criminal point. So they talked about contravention to justice, and it's not the same thing. This week we received Mr. Warnick, who came and tried to not say anything to committee. Now, with your interrogations, Mr. Warnick, was he cooperative? Did he cooperate? Did he provide interesting details? Because we have the verbatim of the conversations, and Mr. Warnick did not want to acknowledge those words. And I mean, I don't remember everything, but Mr. Wilson Rainbow was told not to use the legal instruments at her disposal. And I'm trying to read between the lines here. Now, during his interrogation, was he more cooperative? Mr. Warnick was addressing our questions. I know Mr. Warnick because we worked together at the Privy Council office, and his answers were brief. That's Mr. Warnick. It's in his nature. And yeah, we understood that he's a man of few words. And I think some people do not understand the mandate of the Ethics Commissioner, Mr. Van Dijk. What do you think about this? The Commissioner of RCMP seems not to properly understand your mandate, where it begins and where it ends. And maybe he needs a small training in that field. Like my predecessor mentioned, the mandate is clear. And the question that we have to ask is whether there are documents that are necessary. And in this case, we're talking about the confidence of the Privy Council. And Mr. Jim made a general comment on not really understanding the role of the commissioner, not in the report, but the general role of the commissioner. And I think maybe you would want to clarify that with us, because it would help us better understand your role. I was a bit surprised to hear that question. Thank you, Mr. Vilmayer. I allowed you a bit more time because I didn't want to interrupt you, but thank you.
Directly at you. You have 6 minutes. Go ahead.
I do appreciate that. Dealing with some technical difficulties on my end with Adobe, but that's another story with those licenses. I'm trying to, for me at the crux of this, and one of the things I've been really stuck with is the Convention of Cabinet Confidence and the issue of the position of the government, particularly this government, I would say, that being both the client and the solicitor, that they have, basically that client solicitor privilege, and then the broader stroke of cabinet confidence as a convention. And I'm wondering to the members, and they can each answer, their thoughts on the effectiveness of that, and whether or not for issues that require greater scrutiny, third, nonpartisan oversight, that through their offices, having access to some of those key documents and information would help provide a better check and balance to the PMO or the Privy Council.
The Act is quite clear. We have access to those documents if we require them and we need them. Obviously, in each case, if there is a refusal to give some or part of documents, we look at them, are they essential to the investigations or not? If they are, we will push it to the ultimate, and as Mario mentioned, we can always go to the federal court if we think it's so germane and so central to an issue that has. But most of the time, you work this out, you understand there's some reluctance, you make sure you get the documents that you need in order to reach your decision. Your decision being, was there a breach of a conflict of interest or not? And that's, in the past has always been worked out, and I'm pretty sure it will be in the future. That being said, the law is quite clear. If we need access to these documents, we can get it. Mario, you want to add something?
I will just add that's precisely what I did. I did assess whether, with the documents and the refusal to provide further documents, I had enough to proceed, and I concluded I did. And there were several instances during my 5 years where Michael and other lawyers who work at the office were able to gain access to cabinet confidences in a very practical, informal way. This was actually the first time that we were opposed with a written no. You will not gain access to additional documents.
As it relates,
the problem with cabinet confidences is that you don't know what you don't have. So you have no idea what you're not seeing. And but I determined I had enough to do Section 9, so I proceeded.
And I think, like for me, in listening to the testimony of the RCMP, and when I hear things that, investigations cannot proceed based on the information that is available, do you believe, and I'll start with Mr. von Finkelstein, do you believe that the RCMP, particularly related to criminal matters, should have access to cabinet confidence documents in order to adequately provide oversight?
I think you should put that question to the RCMP rather than me.
Okay.
Or to see
if you don't want to answer,
they feel they have enough. Obviously, nobody should be able to hide behind criminal acts, and the investigators should have access to all the facts necessary to determine whether a crime has been committed or not.
Thank you. Stories were posted this morning about additional information as it relates to the Prime Minister's trip to Jamaica. And in particular, I note the way in which the information is coming out in trickles, dribs and drabs. First, there's a bit of a denial, and then there's a bit of a deflection, and then there's a dig in, and then we find that there's more and more information. So, in light of the various Trudeau reports, and in light of some of these discrepancies, do you believe that amendments to the Conflict of Interest Act should provide, particularly, to the office holders and to the Prime Minister, what do you suggest that we do to tighten that up so that the perception of a conflict and the real conflict are dealt with in a seriousness that helps kind of restore the public confidence and trust?
You used the word perception right now, and I think it's very important to do that. Unfortunately, the Act deals with conflict of interest. There is no apparent or a conflict of interest provision. There is in the code for the members of Parliament, as you know, for House of Commons, as you know. That's a question that you could put in. That is not only a real conflict, but a perception of or apparent conflict of interest. Another one, since you're talking about the Jamaica trip, is, for instance, should there be a ceiling on gifts? Right now there's a complete exception for gifts from a friend. You could say, well, that's fine, but if the gift is too large, it may create the wrong appearance, and maybe we should have a monetary limit on it.
I really deeply appreciate that, because I know that there was a past commentary that, well, if they're wealthy, why shouldn't wealthy people be able to give wealthy gifts? But I think to the average person watching, the average person struggling in this economy, that extravagant gifts in the tens of thousands of dollars, $80,000 plus in these luxury settings, it begs back to my earlier points about sponsored travel and other things, that in a time with conspiracy theories and distrust in government, that there needs to be that cap. So I'm glad to hear that reflected in the testimony today. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. That concludes our first round of questioning. We've got 5-minute rounds followed by 2.5, 2.5. And just a reminder to the committee, I do want to leave some time because Mr. Villemure wants to bring up an issue in front of the committee that should not take too much time. Mr. Brock, for 5 minutes, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for your attendance today on this important study. I'm going to read to you a portion of a mandate letter that Justin Trudeau supplied to one of his ministers, Minister Anand. Talked about raising the bar on openness, effectiveness, and transparency in government. Says it also means humility and continuing to acknowledge mistakes when we make them. Canadians do not expect us to be perfect. They expect us to be diligent, honest, open, and sincere in our efforts to serve the public interest. Yet February 7, 2019, the Globe and Mail cites unnamed sources, reports that Justin Trudeau and his aides attempted to pressure Jody Wilson-Raybould while she was AG to intervene in the prosecution of SNC, and that exasperation and her lack of cooperation was one reason for shuffling her out of the justice portfolio. Justin Trudeau, when pressed by reporters at some event in Canada, looked Canadians right in the eye and said the Globe story was false. He lied to Canadians. He ultimately received your report, Mr. Dion. He says, well, he disagrees with some of the findings. He accepts the report and takes responsibility for the mistakes that he made, whatever that means. He didn't elaborate. We all know your conclusions. Your conclusions were well founded. Your conclusions were based on all the evidence that you received. You took it upon yourself, I believe, Mr. Dion, to identify all the relevant witnesses and the evidence that you hoped to be able to discharge your responsibility. Is that correct? And I've totaled 14 individuals that you ultimately either interviewed or received by way of affidavit or some other written documentation. I contrast that to the RCMP. And I can't express how profoundly disappointed I am as a member of Parliament but as a former officer of the court and a former Crown attorney, of the shipshod way that they conducted this investigation. They only interviewed Jody Wilson-Raybould twice. They interviewed Jessica Prince, her chief of staff. They interviewed Natalie Drouin, deputy attorney general, and nobody else. And when I asked the commissioner not too long ago, why didn't he actually seek out some information from the prime minister himself, the person of interest? They didn't think that they had sufficient grounds to do that. That really disturbs me, sir. I'm not going to be asking you about RCMP decisions, but what I am going to ask you about is when you interviewed Justin Trudeau, was he forthright with you? Did you get the impression he was giving you all the information that you requested? Was he holding anything back?
So I recall the interview vividly. It was long, over 2 hours. Prime Minister was accompanied by a few lawyers. And he did respond to every question we asked. There was no feeling of resistance or trying to indirectly avoid questions. He did provide answers to every question that we had.
Okay. Your standard of referral to the police, I believe you said, is on reasonable grounds. Is that a reasonable ground test? And perhaps to Mr. Is it Aquilino? Is it the same reasonable ground test that law enforcement uses in terms of laying a charge?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So, and again to Michael and to you, Mr. Dion, we all know that there's two elements to any criminal offense, the actus reus, the mens reus. The actus reus is the act of the pressure exerted, either by Justin Trudeau himself or his aides. The mens rea requires a specific intent. Now, I want to circle back to your report, Mr. Dion, paragraph 284. I'm going to read it out to you. It's very, very, very brief. Here, in contrast, the evidence abundantly shows that Mr. Trudeau knowingly, the operative word, knowingly, emphasis mine, sought to influence Ms. Wilson-Raybould both directly and through the actions of the agents. That's the operative term I look for as a former Crown attorney. So I'd like to know your opinion, perhaps Mr. Aquilino, in terms of the reasonable ground test. Did that not give you the ability to make that referral based on that finding?
I think that those are legal issues. Criminal side, the Conflict of Interest Act, knowingly in the context does not necessarily mean knowingly for the mens rea purposes under the criminal code. That's a legal issue. So
Well, I disagree respectfully. I think it knowingly means the same thing. It's an intentional act to do something knowingly, as opposed to innocently, accidentally. Knowingly is purposeful.
Sorry.
Sorry.
You're gonna have another opportunity to ask
Thank you.
questions if you like. Mr. Housefather, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Mr. Dion, I have a question for you, a little bit of an esoteric one. In Section 9 of the Act, it reads, no public office holder should use his or her position as a public office holder to seek to influence the decision of another person, clear, so as to further the public office holder's private interest, clear, that makes all kinds of sense, or those of the public office holder's relatives or friends, makes lots of sense. But then it goes on to add or to improperly further another person's private interests, thus lumping in the other person to something that would directly benefit the public office holder or his family or friends or her family or friends in the same breath. Do you believe it should be the same, the wording should be equivalent in this case? And I guess I'll come to it from the perspective of a public office holder is frequently, as you know, seeking to push government to deliver funding or grants to companies in their riding. They're not doing it for themselves; they're doing it for the benefit of their constituent, their community. How is that equivalent? Because in this case, we're talking about Mr. Trudeau and SNC-Lavalin. Nobody is alleging Trudeau has any private interest in SNC-Lavalin, or that he's benefiting personally, financially from anything that goes to SNC-Lavalin. How are these concepts intertwined? And would it be better if there was one language that related to your own personal benefit and another clause that dealt with the improper dealings related to a third party? I don't know if you understand the question, but it's been in my mind for a bit.
I do understand the question. I've never actually asked myself the question, so therefore I cannot offer any improvised answer. Section 9 was the subject of parliamentary debate. It was part of the Accountability Act. I assume the crafters knew what they were doing, and my role was to implement Section 9 as it exists. I don't have a view, I'm sorry, at this point, because I've never thought about it.
Okay, I understand. So then, can we get? Oh, of course, Mr. Van Finkels, please.
Overlooking the word improperly. This section deals, first of all, influence anything further, somebody's private interests or the press of a friends, etc. And then when you're talking about unrelated third parties, it is improperly furthering it. So, you're obviously part of your job is to further, like, the interest of your constituents, etc. But do it properly, don't do it improperly. And that's the distinction in the Act.
And there are reports from the office going back several years that deal with that. It's only when you go out of outside accepted avenues that it becomes improper.
No, and I understand. I've read the Trudeau report where you do a detailed analysis of how you arrive at the idea that it was improper in terms of crossing the Shawcross Doctrine. I do understand that. I was just wondering, because even though it's improper, one of them relates to your own personal interest and your own benefit, and the other relates to the benefit to a third party. And I just thought it might be.
Although, Mr. Chair, I'll add that in the document we do indicate that the Prime Minister or one of his assistants, Monsieur Bouchard, mentioned that there was an election. There will be an election one day, and it's important to win an election. And this matter could have an impact on Mr. Trudeau's electability in Papineau. That was mentioned by that witness. So. Maybe there was also some interest on the part of the Prime Minister.
Okay, I'm reading your report and I understand. I'm trying to then get to another question in terms of the entire interactions here. Was it because Ms. Wilson-Raybould was the Attorney General in this capacity that you looked at it in a different way than if it had been a different minister? For example, if she had been acting in her capacity as Minister of Justice, because of the very different rules related to the Attorney General?
Yeah, the central issue of the Shawcross doctrine, of course, was related to her role as Attorney General. It played a very important role.
So if the same interactions had happened, because again, we don't know if anybody in the Prime Minister's office at that time understood the Shawcross doctrine, if they really understood that there should be a difference in the way they treated the Attorney General versus another cabinet minister. If this had been, for example, the Minister of Health, and it had been a decision related to health care, would you have treated it in the same way? Would there have been that impropriety?
Again, it's hypothetical. I don't know if there's any doctrine that exists in the sphere of health, so I frankly don't have any idea. But I would like to add that Ms. Wilson-Raybould on several occasions tried to explain the very specific nature of her role as Attorney General to those who were trying to influence her. So they had an opportunity to reflect on that. Because that's one of the first things you learn in criminal law, the independence of the prosecution. And I know that when I was at the Department of Justice, this was sacred. So she tried to explain that, but maybe they didn't understand. Okay.
Yes, you are. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dion. Monsieur Villemure pour 2 minutes.
Mr. Villemure for 2 minutes and a half. I'll ask the same question to both witnesses, knowing that I have 2.5 minutes. Now, would you consider over your different mandates that involved cabinet confidence that we should better clarify the circumstances under which we should have access to documents, or whether, as part of an investigation of this nature involving a minister or a prime minister, that there should be a special procedure that would allow you to be able to shed light and maybe even more have a different judgment, because do you think that this would allow you to ensure that you have everything available? Because I have a feeling from previous witnesses that they experienced problems with the cabinet confidence, whereas I believe that it is a good thing in itself. But do you think that there will be, we need to make changes there, Mr. Dion? I think it's possible to handle every situation within the current or the given legal framework. And so I think it's enough to address the needs, arising needs. And this was the first time that there was a collision since the creation of the office 18 years ago. So it's not worth the 3 years and 2 millions. Exactly. I agree with my predecessor. It is not an issue, um, as we mentioned, and I think that we always have the possibility to go before the court if we think we need further documents. We are not talking here about uh, criminal activity. We're talking about conflict of interest, and we have many other ways of, going about this. So you drafted the Trudeau 1, 2, and 3 reports. Trudeau 1 was Miss Dawson, so 2 and 3 in your case. And from outside, as I was looking at it, I would see certain trends reemerge. I was seeing some sort of laissez-faire attitude with regard to discipline. What did you think about this situation? I think I addressed this issue the last time I appeared when I was a commissioner, and I wished that certain members of government should take the question more seriously. Some take it seriously, others a bit less. And that was my perception a year ago. Maybe things have evolved in a positive direction since then. My successor would tell you. So you said that some members acting in a very uh,
Mr. Green, 2.5. Go ahead.
I'm
Mr.
sorry, there's
Green.
always a bit of a delay on the translation side, so I can't hear it get picked up. Thank you very much. I have a question for Mr. Dion because it's, our committee's prerogative to try to provide recommendations, hopefully get something out of these studies. And so I'm wondering for you, in retrospect now, what lessons might have been learned from your involvement in the SNC-Lavalin affair?
Not much. I think we had the tools. I was able to launch an investigation very quickly after the facts emerged, the allegations emerged, I should say. So there's not much that need to be changed, and nothing I can think of at this point in time that relates to the conduct of investigations. I think it works well the way it is now. And there's a margin of maneuver that the commissioner needs, and the commissioner has the margin of maneuver. And I would leave it as that for the time being.
So if the same situation were to occur again, there's no, notwithstanding the fact that the cabinet confidence issue was still present, there's no different approaches that you may have taken to try to get more information?
When people are interviewed, that's how we refer to those interviews. They are under oath. They're placed under oath. There is a stenographer present. There's a transcript. So it's a pretty solemn event. People take it seriously, answer the questions. We use the transcripts extensively in preparing the reports. So I think we have enough formality as it is to be able to do our work. My successor has enough powers to do the work, in my opinion. He may differ, I don't know.
So if there's enough, that's great. If we were to look at improving the standard, again, going back to the notion of cabinet confidence, could there be anything that we could contemplate as a committee that might trigger an automatic disclosure for certain levels? Or are you simply here in your testimony today saying everything's fine, nothing to see here? Should this happen again, we can expect the same kind of outcomes?
The one thing I haven't said is it would be hard to create such a list because there is a myriad of possible scenarios. It's always dangerous to try to put an exhaustive list of situations. That's why I think with the flexible approach, what I did with Mr. Shugart was my approach. Try to impose some, if you wish, pressure on getting more documents. I did not know until I received the reply what the reply would be. Michael can attest to that, because I don't know what was in those documents that I didn't get to see. So the answer was no, and then we accepted the answer. It's hard to imagine a statute could change that.
Okay,
Okay.
merci.
Thank you so
Mr.
much.
Dion.
Thank you for the extra time, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, no worries, Mr. Green. We're going to go 4 and 4. I'd already predetermined that in advance of Mr. Green speaking. Mr. Kirk and then Mr. Baines for 4 minutes. On va donner un peu de temps pour Monsieur Villemire à la fin.
We'll allow some time for Mr. Villemire at the end of the session.
Thanks very much, and appreciate the testimony here today. Mr. Aquilino, Mr. Brock had asked a question about the Prime Minister having, quote, knowingly influenced former Justice Minister and Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould, and that term knowingly. And it's my understanding that in civil and criminal law, it's a fairly low threshold, but it is interpreted the same. And I'm just wanting, if I could, Mr. Aquilino, your interpretation of that threshold and whether or not that threshold was in fact met, and your interpretation of the events that took place related to that question around him having knowingly influenced.
Sure. So when you apply the facts of what transpired here to the wording of the offense, so 139 sub 2, you have to apply the knowingly standard to the act of obstructing, perverting, or defeating the course of justice. And what the case law says that it takes more than a mere moral lapse or an ethical lapse of judgment. It takes something, an additional step, so a corrupt intent, a criminal intent. And this is where we had difficulty in establishing that intent.
So when it comes to the establishment of that intent, at the time, and I was not elected at the time when I followed this, both the breaking story in the Globe and Mail and what transpired, the damning testimony that Jody Wilson-Raybould had brought forward at committee, and just the whole, it was extraordinary to watch. I was very troubled at the time how narrow the constraints were on the evidence that could be obtained both by the Office of the Ethics Commissioner, but also in light of that to the Justice Committee and presumably the impacts that had in relation to the RCMP being able to get to the bottom of exactly what you've referred to about knowing what that intent is. So could having more evidence, understanding what the bigger context is, and certainly you don't know what you don't know, but if there was more information available, could that have influenced and led to you, the RCMP, and others coming to a different conclusion? Mr. Dion?
Purely speculative. So it's impossible to answer your question. Of course it could, or maybe it could have. I don't know.
So it could have, and I think that's the question. Why were the constraints so tight? And certainly that's an outstanding question that remains, and an incredible disappointment that there was not a willingness for the government to be more transparent, and it leads one to ask the question about what is there to hide. Now, I do want to ask another question, because yesterday the Liberals tabled a amendment to the Canada Elections Act. And in that, on page 2, there's a very interesting change to the election date. And as the public, I'm sure, is very aware, MPs qualify for a pension after 6 years of service. The election was planned to be held on October 20th of 2025. That would have been 1 day short for MPs elected in 2019 to qualify for their pension. And while Conservatives are calling for an election immediately, I'm just wondering if that delay in the page 2 of this act, if that would be a conflict of interest for MPs to basically vote on something that would be the difference between them either qualifying or not qualifying for their pension.
Very, very quick response on that, please. Very quick.
You as MPs have the power, make the rules for yourself, including your code of conduct, and also when elections are held, etc. That's not a conflict of interest. It's something that you are charged. It's a duty. One would expect you do it in the public interest and not in your personal interest.
Thank you.
But that's
Would there be
that's enough time.
Could there be a perceived conflict in that?
No, Mr. Kirk, I'm sorry, I'm over time. I think the commissioner answered the question. Go ahead, Mr. Baines, 4 minutes. I had Mr. Baines. Ms. Khalid, go ahead, please. 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And just to clarify, I know that my colleague asked this question about nefariousness and perhaps conspiracy theories going down that rabbit hole, but October 20th of 2025 is the day of Diwali, which many hundreds of thousands of Hindu Canadians celebrate. So I think it's good for us to be. Sorry, Mr. Brock, are you interrupting my time here? Oh, okay. I'm glad that you are. Thank you so much. So just wanted to clarify that and put that on the record. Can we, Mr. Aquilino, can we just talk about sanctions? What kind of sanctions do you feel would be fair, equitable, and enforceable? And do you think that the current sanctions are enough as it stands right now?
Yeah, point out Mr. Aquilino is here in order to help Mr. Dion recall the facts regarding Trudeau 2 report. He's not here as a witness to give to speak.
Then perhaps to Mr. Dion then.
I've expressed the view in the past that maybe the issue of penalties should be looked at. There is an absence of direct penalty in relation to the act. It should be looked at. In terms of the credibility of the system, it would help if there was a possible sanction to be recommended by the commissioner, but to be imposed potentially by the House or by another upper authority, if you wish. So that's been my view throughout. I don't know what my successor thinks of that, but that was my
Thank you. And to that, Mr. von Finkenstein, are you considering reviewing those sanctions at all?
I am in the job now, literally of 1 month, so it's busy. It's a temporary period, 7 months, so it's a bit early to. Clearly, when the chairman congratulated me on appointment and asked for, do I have any views towards improving the act? And I wrote him yes, and undoubtedly there will be some, and I will express it at that point in time. Right now, as you know, the main penalty for breaching the act is that you basically you get certified that your reputation is not what you're holding it out to be, that you do not understand your job and you acted in conflict. And that's a pretty bad penalty for an elected official. Should it be supplemented by these suggestions along what Mario suggested? It's something I think I would like to study a bit more in detail before making any statement on it.
Thank you. I have one more question for you. I know that members opposite have been directing and demanding that you haven't really done your job effectively on this specific case and many others. Can you talk to us about the importance of independence of the work that you do, the work that the RCMP does, just the same that you wouldn't be directed by political officials? Would you then go and direct RCMPs as to how they conduct their investigations?
I'm sorry. I mean, as you know, I'm not a public servant. I report to the Speaker of the House, etc. So that's to insulate me from political. The act is quite clear. Decisions are to be made on the merits, and decisions are made public. And they're made public immediately, as we do, like, for instance, in Trudeau 2, as the same day that the report came out, it was also published. So there can no opportunity to hide it. So we're trying to do the whole scheme is to be as public and as open and as fair as possible. Can it be improved? Sure, everything can be improved, but I mean, there's no glaring omission or fault right now that I'm aware of. As far as the RCMP is, you should ask them, not me, as to whether they feel they need more independence or not.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Ms. Khalid, and certainly we appreciate the independence of the office as it reports to Parliament. Commissioner, I want to thank you on behalf of the committee for being here today, and again, congratulate you on your appointment. I, as the committee chair, have the utmost confidence in your ability to do your job independently and effectively, and I look forward to continuing to work with you. Mr. Dion, again, thank you for your service to our nation and retirement. You seem to come back every once in a while at the request of the committee, and I appreciate you taking the time to do that when you could be someplace else. But thank you, Mr. Dion, and Mr. Aquilino. Thank you for your time today. Je vais donner la parole à Monsieur Villeneuve.
I will now like to turn it to Mr. Villeneuve for an additional item which he would like to discuss with the committee. And just to inform Mr. Vilmur that we are preparing an in-camera report, so we cannot talk about the report, but you have something to share with the committee, and maybe the committee would be in agreement with you. Well, over to you. We conducted the study on social media. The report is currently being drafted, but for many things, sometimes the context may change. And last week, we learned that the Ministry of the Department of Innovation launched a national scrutiny exercise on TikTok. And maybe TikTok knew, maybe they didn't know. We have no idea. But the picture that was painted was far from something that looks like a national security study. And recently, TikTok was qualified as a digital fentanyl in the 21st century. We've heard all sorts of things, but the fact that a Canadian minister requested a national security study, I would want to doubt the validity of this report. Maybe there's a possibility of us issuing a warning or mentioning that this report should be completely cancelled and that we don't publish it. Now, I would like to throw the question to the group here, because I believe that if we don't have a clear action with regard to this report, our report may be ridiculous, so to speak.
I just warning the committee now, just based on the services that are available with us. But I will say that I am in agreement with Mr. Vilmur that we put the report on the shelf for now, pending the results of a national security review. And then if at that time we need to reopen the report, we can do that and have witnesses reappear if we need to, because there may be things that we might add to the report. My concern, frankly, is that we're going to make recommendations that are contrary to what the National Security Review provides for, and are the results of the National Security Review, and it's going to look pretty foolish on our part to make these recommendations if they are in fact contrary or contradict what the National Security Review proposes. So I don't think there's any harm in holding on to dealing with this report until such time as this review comes forward. And the other thing that I would say too is that there was no indication at all during the time of our study that this National Security Review was going on until it was made public last week. So go ahead, Ms. Khalid.
Chair, do we know what the timeline looks like for the NCIRA to come back?
No, but I am going to take it upon myself on behalf of the committee to find out, okay?
Can we then table this question as to whether we're going to be shelving this report until we figure out what the timelines look like? To me, it makes more sense if we're able to bring in TikTok maybe for one more time, to bring in whatever relevant witnesses for one more time to address these concerns and then include that within the context of the report, rather than just shelving it for an indefinite period of time.
Okay, so here, this was my plan, just so that the committee knows, or the plan for the committee. When we come back from the 2-week constituency period, we were going to start the report the second, I think it's the second day of the report in camera. So so what I can do is I can schedule committee business at that time to provide an update to the committee, and then we can carry on with this discussion later, if that's okay with the committee, until I find out information as far as the timelines of what the National Security Review is. Would that be acceptable to committee? Okay. And that covers what you're asking for? Okay. Are we all okay with that? Mr. Barrett, you good? Monsieur Vail? Mr. Green, sorry. Okay, thank you. All right. Merci, Monsieur Vilmur. That concludes.
Thank you, Mr. Vilmur.
You have an effective couple of weeks in your constituencies, and look forward to seeing everybody when we come back. And again, condolences to the Mulrooney family as they head into a difficult period on Saturday in the celebration of the former Prime Minister's life in Montreal. Thank you. Meeting's adjourned.